Hello, it's Peter Wright and Kathleen Beauvais with another edition of the Yakking Show, Harmony, your path to wholeness channel. And as always, we have an interesting guest for you today. But first, let's introduce co-host Kathleen Beauvais. Hi, Kathleen. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great, Peter. Thank you. And thank you all so very much for tuning in to our show. We so appreciate having you. And as Peter mentioned, we do have another special guest with us today. We are very excited to welcome Patrick Eilers to the show. Hello, Patrick. How are you?
Hi, Peter. Hi, Kathleen. How are you both today?
Good, thank
Wonderful.
you.
Now,
Good.
Patrick has a master's degree in clinical psychology. He is also a graduate of Moody Theological Seminary-Michigan and has been working in the counseling field for 8 years, but has specialized in sexual and porn addiction for the last 4 years. This is a very deep and interesting topic that we are going to be discussing today. So let's just jump right in, Patrick. We hear so much about addictions to drugs, alcohol, even gambling, but not so much about sex addiction. How prevalent is this issue? And is this a typical is this typical for males or females? Give us some details on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Appreciate being a chance to be here, and certainly would like to talk about some of the things going on with sex addiction. And it is something that is becoming more prevalent. Certainly, as the internet has grown, as things have changed with the way the world has been, probably over the last 20 years, it's definitely been something that's on the increase. We see. Majority of the clients I work with typically are male. I say I don't really have too many female clients, but I know that is a rising area, that especially in the pornography and erotic literature sort of scene. There certainly is more
Mhm.
females that are becoming more sort of part of this behavior. So let me see, we're seeing part of that as well. So, I think it definitely depends on your generation, so to speak. I mean, there's some people who've been lifelong, they've maybe 50, 60 years old and have had a lifelong addiction and didn't recognize that they had that. Some of the younger folks, definitely it's kind of a normalized behavior. You see a lot of people come in with, I didn't know this was something that was a problem until it became a problem, kind of thing. So a lot of different viewpoints on it. Certainly for younger males, I would say probably from 40 and younger. A lot of folks definitely have grown up with the internet. They certainly have an aspect that they've been involved with this behavior from a very young age, 6, 7, 8 years old. We see a lot of these early contacts for
Wow.
people. So certainly something that has been impacted and has been part of their experience growing up and being as an adolescent into a young adult. So I think it's definitely a growing issue, and I don't have any immediate stats for you, but certainly that's something that's on the rise.
Wow. You've already covered the rise largely due to the availability of the internet, because I'm a boomer and I was brought up in a very conservative, British-oriented culture in Southern Africa, in a country called Rhodesia, where Playboy was illegal, Penthouse very illegal, and one could go to jail if one was caught with
Mm,
an 8 millimeter porn movie, right? So access was
yeah.
very difficult, and very few people had access to it. And the idea of porn or sex addiction was unheard of in those
Mm.
days. Totally, totally unheard of. I guess there were sex addicts, but it was all below the radar. So is the main issue the internet? You also mentioned cultural changes in the last 20 years. Is it a combination of both?
It does seem to be a combination of both. I would definitely say that. I think one thing is the ease of access. Certainly, the
Hmm.
fact that you can get to it a lot easier. A lot of kids, especially if they're younger generation, they tend to sort of, again, they find out through school, they find out through other means of the internet. There's a lot of things on social media that are not meant to be sexual, but they're sexualized. So
Yeah,
there's
right.
certainly aspects of hiking posts and workouts and those kind of things. A lot of those things are not necessarily intended to be sexual, but they become sexualized. So we see a lot of the even social media amplifying that. I think there's certainly a large aspect of that. Part of it is being ease of access. But I think the other part of it too is that, like I said earlier, that there's an aspect of it where people feel like this is an issue, or something that's not a problem for them. They don't really see it being a problem. They kind of suspect, especially from a male perspective, this is what guys do. Guys watch this
Hmm.
stuff, guys see it. There's everybody's doing it, but we don't talk about it, which in itself is kind of an irony. But I think that when you see that how how that's changed, there's certainly an aspect of that there's also been moving more toward even people being able to produce pornography at an availability of an age, especially with OnlyFans and some of those kind of things. That's a personalized production now, rather than it being something that's either in a magazine or even on a website that used to cost something. A lot of pornography is really free and available to everybody. So that's another area where I think it's definitely amplifying and causing that to be to really really hurt how people think about things and see relationships, and certainly see the overall view of their own life and themselves.
Kathleen, sorry, can I jump in with a follow-up? Because from what Patrick's been saying, something reminded me, something that somebody said to me about these home porn movies, and I'm not inclined to watch them, but what they said to me was they were somewhat horrified in that a lot of the women in those homemade porn movies seemed to be coerced, or there was a degree of violence exhibited towards the women. So my question to you is, men who suffer from an addiction to porn or sex, does that change the way they view women, and does it increase the likelihood of them inflicting violence on women? Sorry, that's a two-part question, but it is of concern. So what's your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the first one for sure, I'd say it definitely affects how they see women. And I would definitely think, one of the biggest things that we talk about is like, what do they believe about themselves? How they believe about the world? What are the glasses that they sort of wear from their worldview? That's a big part of that. A lot of the addiction certainly really stem out of the fact of how afraid of the world sort of people are, afraid of being intimate with people, being able to kind of, my analogy is sort of bring their fence down, and be open with other people. So there is an aspect of that certainly plays a role. And again, there is a lot more of what would be considered hardcore pornography that's now like mainstream. So that's another part of that, what is expected out of that relationship. I think for both male and female, the expectation of what that looks like, what sex is supposed to be, what relationship is like, and understanding what love is. I think that's a big part of that. So a lot of those things get warped because of that, again, because of the belief. And so there's a large aspect of that. If I watched this since I was, let's say I was 8 years old and I started watching it, that's what I'm going to understand sex to be. And so a lot of times, especially when we're talking about pornography, it's called fantasy sex in the technical term. And the fantasy sex is really the possibility of what could happen. So these possibilities are really kind of endless. And they usually, more and more people tend to obsess over them. I don't like that word too much, but that's a word that basically describes people's thought process, right? They become kind of hooked on the thoughts and the possibilities, and so that fantasy is always kind of there running in the back of their mind.
So how do you recognize sexual addiction? So when someone comes to you and says, I think I have a problem, but how do you actually recognize this as a problem, or just, I don't know, just something that's just who they are?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. I mean, there's definitely some, there's some, I would call symptomologies we look for. The biggest thing, as a certified sex addiction therapist, we have access to some tools that maybe other therapists wouldn't have. So there's what they call a screening tool. It's called a SAST, and basically it's kind of gives an overview of like a number, basically average population to people who are struggling with other addiction kind of behavior. So that can kind of help us guide into, do we want to take a further assessment? And there's another assessment called a sexual dependency inventory. And essentially that assessment gives a whole layout of about 20 different unhealthy sexual behaviors that we can kind of get a sense of, okay, is addiction present for this person? The other things we look for would be, number one, is they really try to stop this behavior. Has this behavior been something that they've kind of had a hard time breaking from? Has it affected their livelihood? So some of those ones you might look for with other addictions, you kind of see some of those similar type of tracking behaviors there. One of the ones I always go back to is what's in your thought life. If you're thinking about sex a majority of the time, I mean, like, again, we're back to fantasy we were just talking about. If my fantasy life is always running, so to speak, it's always in the background, I'm always thinking about it. That's going to be a large part of kind of what's going to drive my behavior. So if I think about it, I'm probably going to do it. So that's really where we want to try to hone in as far as, when you talk about an addiction, are people utilizing this thought and utilizing the behavior of pornography and other types of unhealthy behavior to try to escape or try to numb or try to get away from kind of where they're at in their reality. And those are the majority of the reason why people typically act out, is because they don't, they're struggling with themselves. Maybe they have a regret from the past, maybe they have a wound from the past, something like that. And so they have a hard time reconciling that. So they tend to turn to these unhealthy behaviors because it's, again, kind of an immediate gratification. One of the things that's really different about porn addiction or sex addiction versus kind of other addictions is that, one is called the process addiction, which is closer to like a food addiction. versus like a substance addiction. And the process addictions are much more difficult because there is an aspect of us that we are naturally wired for sex, we're naturally wired for food, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're a little more powerful than just removing the substance. A lot of people come in and the first thing they say is, I just want to stop this behavior. And that is part of it. I mean, certainly we want people to stop the behavior, but then there's a secondary part of how do you change your lifestyle? How do you change your behavior so that you can actually maintain that? Because if you just try to stop the behavior, all you're going to do is what they call white knuckling. And basically it's just kind of like driving through, the floodwaters and trying to see if you can just come to the other side, and you're hoping that you're not going to be able to go down that path you were before. So a lot of times when we're talking about process addiction, there's kind of a twofold replacement. You have to, how do you change your lifestyle so that you can maintain healthy behavior?
And
Interesting.
I just have just a follow up to that about, we talked about cultural changes too over time, but have you noticed a big difference among with sex addiction given different cultures? Like I know in North Americans probably more prevalent, I'm guessing, versus other culture. I don't know. Is there something to that?
There might be. I mean, I certainly think from just the process of in America, like the different like locational cultures we have here. I mean, obviously, so I'm in the Midwest, and so we're kind of in sort of the conservative but not ultra conservative area of the country. That would probably differ from each of the coasts, because there's a little more liberal side in the culture there. But like down south, I know like in like what's used to be considered the Bible Belt area, I've done some training with other therapists down there, and one of their big fights is that people don't believe it exists.
Oh,
So there's people who don't even think it exists, all the way to the extreme of, well, it's not a problem. So you kind of have a wide range of that you're working with. For me, I don't really see too much of a cultural difference as far as people coming in. Most of the people we see are typically, of the same type of ethnical kind of cultural background. But they're not, again, like I said, some of it can really depend on kind of what their family background really has been, as kind of the bigger part of that. There is not a ton of diversity as far as like, people struggling with it. Kind of affects everybody in lots of different ways and in all different ages. So I haven't really seen too much of like a cultural standout other than what I just kind of mentioned with parts of the country.
Sure. Interesting. So Patrick, are there typical personalities that are more susceptible to porn or sex addiction? In other words, is it more common amongst introverts? Is it narcissistic personalities who are more likely to be addicted? What is there a pattern there or not really?
In my experience, there isn't too much of a pattern as far as personality traits being correlated with the behavior. Now, a lot of the behavior makes people start to become, again, more introverted because they're isolated. So that's a big part of that. So some of it's the consequence of the behavior. There are people who, have a real, a word that gets thrown around right now a lot is narcissism. And so again, there's a narcissistic personality disorder, and I don't know a lot about personality disorders, so I'm not going to go too far down to that. But then there's traits that are narcissistic, meaning that the person has a really hard time breaking from seeing their own version and how they experienced life and those kind of things. And definitely sex addiction, by the nature of the addiction, makes you more focused about you. You don't really see how it's affecting other people. So this is very common with the partners. So like if you're, like, let's say it's a married couple and he's been struggling with porn use for his entire life and she doesn't know about it and she finds out about it. One of the initial struggles they typically will have is that he'll try to minimize the behavior because to him, it's been not even about her. In most cases, it's not. But a lot of these cases where it's, she's experiencing her life, he's experiencing his life, and, a lot of these uses get minimized or some of those kind of things. And so her interpretation a lot of times is, well, he's just a narcissist. He's just focused on him. He doesn't really want to change anything. And that isn't always true, but I definitely feel like there's a part of denial you have to break through with that, and you have to realize how serious it actually has affected your life. And I think even culturally, that's a tough sort of thing to wrap your mind around, because it doesn't feel necessarily as bad as some of the other, like, if you have an alcohol addiction, it's out of control. It's much more obvious, versus sex addiction is much more hidden. It's the deceit of how deep it can go is far greater for people than other addictions, I would say, because it's not as obvious.
And sorry, if I can just continue on this thought, and this might be a controversial question, and you might give a controversial answer, I suspect that the rise of feminism, which has had its good side, has had this could be a consequence of the darker side of feminism in that it's reduced the confidence level of many men in their interaction with women and possibly turned them towards self-gratification in the form of anonymous sex or porn. Have I got something there, or am I way off beam on that one?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to say it's directly correlated with anything with feminism. I mean, it might be, but I think that what I would say is that dating has changed. So the
Okay.
way people date now is vastly different than what they were even dating 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so there's an aspect of how dating has become and how the empowerment of, to some degree, empowerment of women, which is not a bad thing in the dating
No.
world. But at the same time, that empowerment has changed and shifted some of the degree for men. And it has become a very visual, trying to find the right word, visual adaptive type of dating society now, rather than like
Okay.
I get to know the person as a person, right? And I get to know them and build on that. All dating apps are based on your first initial physical attraction to someone, right? You
Right.
swipe left or
Right.
swipe right, right? And so there's an element of that where, and not that that wasn't somewhat true in the past, but it's a consumerism type basis now. So I think that really has changed a major part of how people now like see dating, how they consume dating, what they do with dating. Again, their goals of dating. And again, we kind of have two extremes. We have people who are just dating to engage in sex, and we have people who are dating to engage in marriage. And so we kind of have those two extremes. And a lot of these extremes that exist, that does create that sort of space for people to, again, what do you do when the people live in the middle? And
Yeah.
and a lot of that can be very secretive. And so again, back to kind of the idea of pornography. Pornography has, I think, really exasperated that part of dating. It really has
Sure.
changed how people have seen dating and how, because I can go on a porn site and I can type in whatever I want and that comes up. Now, if again, earlier I said, kind of traverse that's what sex means to me. I'm going to go now to the dating site and go, well, I'm expecting that this girl's going to do the same thing I just saw the porn star do 20 minutes ago. I just, so there's an aspect of that. I think that you're right, Peter. I think there's certainly an aspect of dating has changed. And because of that, is it a chicken and egg kind of thing? Is dating changed because of porn, or is porn changed because of dating? They think they have a strong correlation either way.
Right.
Sure.
Makes
Sure.
sense. Yeah. So
Wow.
are sex addicts typically sexual predators?
In my experience, no, but our particular practice doesn't work particularly with people who are sex offenders. So the one thing I would say about sex offenders is that typically there is a range of what they call paraphilias, and paraphilia is just either an unusual or potentially it could be illegal draw to something specific. So like a paraphilia, like people talk about foot fetishes, that's a type of paraphilia. So paraphilia could be, being attracted to children. That certainly is an aspect of that. But it doesn't necessarily correlate that they have to be you don't have to have paraphilia and be an addict or vice versa. So I haven't worked a lot with people who've offended or been in the law, but I know that a lot of cases, as far as escalation goes, again, we talked earlier about, what I fantasize about is what I'm probably going to do. So if I start, let's say I start out with, sort of adult only porn and I start going slower and slower, quicker, over a period of time, I get closer and closer to what's becoming not, illegal porn. Eventually, if I traverse over that, that's where some of that I think can certainly elevate for folks, as far as, that those behaviors go from watching or, sort of watching to then watching illegal, then to actually, pursuing a behavior. It doesn't mean it's going to do that. But I think it's a slippery slope. I mean, I think it doesn't, some people can definitely, that elevation, just like any behavior, can become what they focus on. And then you have a circumstance like that.
Right.
Well, so another aspect of that slippery slope let me ask you the question. People who've experienced failed sexual relationships, are they more likely than the average to get on that slippery slope and become porn addicts because of their failure in the real sexual world?
I don't know if it means that they're more likely to become a sex addict. I think more what happens is that those can be what those wounds we kind of talked about earlier. Certainly their first early experiences of dating. If you experience a lot of rejection, especially if you're like in a high school setting or whatever, and you experience a lot of rejection, there's a lot of safety in pornography. And I say that because that's where it's the illusion that's safe, right? You don't have to be vulnerable. You don't have to, you don't have to bring any of yourself necessarily to that. You can just, self-gratify and kind of move on. And in my experience, this is probably more controversial. I'm going to say is that unhealthy sexual behavior almost always is self-inflicted, right? It's always gained. The idea is to be about you. Healthy sexual behavior is usually almost always relationally driven.
Right.
So I think that people always look for like, what's the distinction between healthy and unhealthy? I always go back to that. Like, okay, well, is it about you or is it about your relationship? And so then that kind of goes back to the idea of like, is masturbation, is pornography for people who are singles, can that be a problem? I think it really comes down to personal conviction. But if let's say that you want to dabble in that, there are risks. You can run a risk of having these things become part of what your obsession or part of what you focus on. So kind of err on the side of judgment, err on the side of caution is that, hey, if you're going to, if you're looking for a healthy relationship and that's what you want, work on your intimacy aspect of being close with somebody so that you can be fulfilled that way, because porn will never fulfill you as much as it says it promises to. It's always an empty bucket. It's never going to be full. So I think that's an aspect that comes up.
Okay, Kathleen, I'm going to ask Patrick another one, seeing as we've got a little bit of time in hand. What advice would you give to a man in probably an older, my sort of generation, boomer man, whose wife or female partner has, after menopause, gone off sex, right? So he's getting no intimacy at home. He morally or financially, ethically, he's not prepared to go and pay for sex outside of the house, right? So one of his outlets presumably would be watching porn movies. Can that be a healthy balance, or is that likely to put him on the slippery slope of looking for more fantasy?
I think it probably puts you more on the slippery slope, simply because, I mean, yes, sex is something that a relationship is healthy for a relationship, but I'd also then lean to the idea of intimacy other ways, right? So how are you also able to connect with your partner in a deeper, more, again, a non-physical way? I mean, again, it doesn't have to be sex. It could be, even just the physical, non-sexual touching and those kind of things in that way. I do think that, again, yes, we are sexual beings, but I also feel like we don't necessarily, sex is not a requirement. I mean, there's a lot of people who, learn to, be self-controlled. They learn how to be able to use that as a motivator to become more focused on other type of, spiritual life and those kind of things. And so there's an aspect of that where I think if your wife is struggling to be intimate with you, if you turn out of the relationship, so the way I always think about it is, when you get married, you kind of come together like this, and people either are going to turn out and they're going to go this way, or they're going to turn back. One's going to turn in, one's going to turn out. Ideally, you want to both be turning back in. What ends up happening typically is if one turns out, then one's just pursuing, and kind of vice versa or whatever. And those are usually unhealthy balances in that way. So like, if you are feeling like you're unfulfilled in your marriage, can you start to work on that intimacy in another way and try to connect in that sense? Because if you go down the way of porn, you might have your physical needs met in that way. But I think, like we talked about earlier, it certainly starts to get you in that denial. How does that draw you away from your partner? Do you start fantasizing about women who are not your wife? Do you start looking at younger women in a different light than you would have before? So it starts to really open up those doors, and you have to, I think there has to be certainly some judgment there of how you want to navigate that, because there are risks to it.
No, thank you. Good answer. Yeah, good advice. Kathleen, sorry, back to you.
So when there is, when a sex addict is in a relationship and they come to you for counseling, I'm assuming it's very important for you to also counsel their partners so that they have an understanding of what's happening and maybe work through it. Am I right on that?
Yes. So I don't work with partners specifically, but we do have therapists who are specifically trained in partner betrayal trauma. That's what basically is called. That's the technical diagnosis, like clinical diagnosis of it. So what ends up happening for most folks is that when a partner finds out, they start to exhibit, and this can be male or female, I've seen it both. They start to exhibit basically PTSD, or very similar to PTSD symptoms. They become hypervigilant. They become, they think there's always something being kept from them. And it really expounds out. I mean, the way I acknowledge it, if your life is a fish tank and you have all these living organisms in the fish tank, when you introduce a betrayal, it's like dropping a couple drops of red food coloring in the water. There's no way that you're not going to be able to now exist with this fish tank full of red water. The relationship, if you want the relationship to keep going, you're going to have to adjust with the red water. And so what ends up happening for a lot of people is, a lot of partners are very much in denial about that. They go, well, hey, you go see Patrick, you work within yourself, you stop doing this behavior and we'll be good. at that point, usually they're already affected by it. So what ends up happening is that we always encourage that the partner works with somebody who's got betrayal trauma certification that works with that to help them understand them. And then, the addict works with somebody who's a certified sex addiction therapist with the intent that eventually they're going to do what they call a disclosure. And the idea is to try to bring everything out so that there is a foundation for healing, which is really from a place of reality. Almost always couples want to go work on with a marriage counselor after there's been a betrayal. If you do that, in my experience and the practice I've worked at experience, typically what ends up happening is you're always going to circle back to the betrayal because that's the true wound. No matter what communication you work on, no matter what intimacy part you work on, whatever, if that wound is not taken care of, that wound will still exist. There's no way to move forward unless you've healed that. And that only comes from a place of knowing what's reality. And so one of the things that comes up a lot of times is that, when we have these, unless both partners are really working in recovery, so to speak, of the process of recovery, through sex addiction, through partner betrayal, you're not going to see a lot of progress, not because the fact that the addict is working, improving himself, it's because the relationship is really damaged. And it depends on the person, it depends on the couple. I mean, some are very much, they kind of work on some things, they improve, and then you don't see that necessarily be too much of a concern. But other ones, it's detrimental from day one. And it's really hard to kind of move forward because there's so much damage in the relationship. So that's one of the things, when it comes to partners, we really try to advocate that the partners need to be, and it's unfair to them, and it's absolutely not fair that they've had to go through that. They're definitely a victim of other people's behavior, but they unfortunately have to be empowered then at the same time to do the things that are going to have to be healed, even though they have been wounded by this behavior that they didn't cause. That isn't fair, but it's something that usually most cases it doesn't improve for them just naturally. Like they have to work on that part.
Right.
Interesting
And in
stuff.
your
Wow.
experience, have couples where one partner is a sex addict, are they able to move on and work past that and stay together?
You're saying, like, have there been couples that like only one partner works on the things and the other partner doesn't?
No, they both work at it, but I mean, I mean, that's I would think a huge issue in a relationship. Huge.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
And I wonder if anybody would be able to move past that.
I think where I've seen a lot of couples in a lot of ways like really improve. And one of the things that's kind of a struggle, I think, for across the board, at least within the practice I work at, the recovery program we have is about 3 to 5 years long. And so both couples, both sides, male and female, partners, betrayers, whatever that looks like, they've just faced a lot of burnout. There's a lot of burnout in the process. So you have to have a focus of where you want to go. You have to have a focus of overcoming this. So this isn't going to be something that's going to sink your relationship.
Right.
And sometimes, when you're 2.5 years in, 3 years in, and you're still feeling like there's still some behaviors that are still going on that haven't improved, that can be really discouraging. So one of the things that really takes a really big precedent in the whole thing is to really be focused on where do you want your relationship to end up going, because that's going to be what you have to hold to in order to continue to go through that journey, because it can be a long journey. And there's a lot of different places and ways that people do that, and a lot of people ways that they bring that up. There's a lot of different type of disclosures out there, and things like that. So sometimes those are always the best for that particular couple. If you throw too much information at somebody too soon and they have trauma, that's usually going to make it worse. So we try to encourage people that it is a slow process, unfortunately, but it is a process that if you take step by step, you'll see the results that you want.
Is the element of betrayal when one partner has not been physically unfaithful and I say just advisedly been addicted to porn, compared to a situation where one partner has actually had an affair and been physically unfaithful? Is there a different degree of betrayal, or is it similar?
It's very similar. In fact, I think actually some cases the porn is actually viewed worse than a physical affair. Now again, that's not in every case, but there are certainly some circumstances where I think some people look at it as, well, you just had an affair with 2,000 women versus you had an affair with one, and that's a lot of cases with the physical affairs. It's somebody who's usually closer to that person, unless it's like a anonymous sex type of thing, or like prostitutes or whatever. that can be a little different, but I do think that certainly the porn can certainly add, because, and again, usually for a lot of cases for partners, I mean, they can't escape that. They go on social media, they watch a movie, they see a commercial. I mean, it's everywhere. So there's an aspect of that. They're, and again, hyperused word in our society, triggered, but there's a lot of triggers that they
Sure.
face. Actually, probably more triggers than even the person who's the addict might.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So what's the first step? If someone comes to you for counseling, they think they've got an addiction. What's the very first step you have to take to start them on the road to recovery?
Yep. So for us, typically we kind of circle back to it earlier. We talked about the SDI.
Yeah.
So sexual dependency inventory would be kind of where we'd start people out at. That gives us an idea of whether or not the addiction is something that's present, and whether or not, we recommendations to work in the recovery program. Our recovery program is based on Dr. Patrick Carnes. He's kind of the original guy who did all the research for sex addiction. So his original book came out in 1983. He's expounded that since then. They originally started out with, I think, 10 different unhealthy behaviors. They've expanded that to 20. And again, that's an expansion that keeps, that continues to expand as we go, as we move forward. So they would do that. After they did the SDI, we could take an evaluation of that. We'd probably do a session or two of kind of reflecting on that, kind of getting them up to speed. Then we recommend, really, it's a 3-part process as far as the recovery goes. They found that that's the most successful, to have all 3 of these aspects. So there's an aspect of individual therapy, which would be working with a certified sex addiction therapist one-on-one. There's an element of group therapy, and our groups they're called process groups, meaning that they are therapist led. Again, some people choose to go to like an SA or an SAA or something like that, a CR, different kinds of support groups in that way, but they're not typically therapist led. So that's one of the differences with our groups. And then the third part is to have a relationship with somebody who's a sponsor or like a mentor. It's kind of helping them through the process. It starts to build the one-on-one relationships. It also starts to build the group relationships. It removes people out of isolation, starts to work on their not only therapeutic skills, or not, sorry, their social skills and some of those kind of things, connecting with other people in that way. So that's where a lot of that comes into play. And that's kind of the whole recovery process, kind of in a nutshell.
Very good. And Kathleen, sorry, I know we're sort of borderline on time, but I've got to ask Patrick one last question. Patrick, you were a graduate of the Theological Seminary. So has your theological training helped you in your counseling and what you do now?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I always consider my training to be kind of an extension of the therapy. Like, obviously learning this program is not necessarily theologically based, but a
Sure.
lot of the counseling I have, especially if I'm working with somebody who is coming from a Christian perspective, my training gives an extension of that. So, focusing on the ability to, how deep do you want to go from a theological perspective? Is this going to be something you can get support from in that way? So, I do think it has helped. I do think it's something that I always try to leave it in the hands of the client, because I always feel like it's one of those things where, as a client, you want to direct some of your therapy to some degree. I mean, the recovery program directs a lot of it, but in this case, also, we need to make the stops that you feel are important to make for you as well. So I think it's important to have kind of that as our guidepost as well. So, yep.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
before I hand over to Kathleen, my final word is thank you for being our guest today, Patrick. I really appreciate that. I'm sure what you've had to say will help a lot of people who are struggling. And quick word to our audience, we've had another great guest today. To make sure you don't miss out on future guests, hop onto our website and sign up for our weekly newsletter. And then you'll know who's coming on next week and this week. And that's it for me. So bye-bye, everybody. Back to Kathleen.
So Patrick, before we let you go, please tell us, how do people contact you?
Yep, absolutely. So a couple different resources. So the practice I'm part of is called North Point Professional Counseling. We are one of Michigan's largest sex addiction resources. So our website is northpoint-counseling.com. You can email me there. You can find us all, a couple of our therapists and my boss are all part of that, a part of our practice. My boss has written a book on disclosure. So for people who are interested in the disclosure process, definitely recommend that. John Sternfeld's, the book is called Partner's Guide to Truth and Healing. I could also recommend my personal Instagram is @_PGE. And if you wanted to reach me, my personal email address is patrickeilers.we@gmail.com. And I think those are the main sources and where to get a hold of me. I'm also on LinkedIn as well if you're interested in connecting that way.
Fantastic. Wow, that was very enlightening, Patrick. Thank you so much for being with us today. And once again, thank you all for tuning into our show. If you're an expert in health, we would love to hear from you. And all you need to do is visit us at theyakkingshow.com, where you will find the contacts tab. Just click on that, where you will find a short application form. And again, we'd love to hear from you. So until next time, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.